The sharp click of her courthouse heels echoed through the sterile hallway as Victoria Harrison entered Dr. Morgan's office. Her professional demeanor faltered momentarily at the sight of Emma, curled up in the consultation chair with a sketchbook clutched tightly in her hands. "What's this about a medical emergency?" Victoria demanded, her litigation-trained voice slicing through the air. "Emma, why aren't you in school?" Dr. Morgan stood, gathering the carefully prepared documentation. "Mrs. Harrison, please sit down. What I'm about to show you requires your full attention." Victoria glanced at her phone, then at her daughter, before reluctantly taking the offered seat. "Make it quick. I have a judge waiting." "Your daughter came to me this morning because she needs help," Dr. Morgan began, laying out the medical records. "I've discovered a pattern of systematic overmedication prescribed by your husband." She pointed to Emma's current blood work results. "These levels are dangerously high for multiple psychiatric medications." Victoria's sharp, lawyer-trained eyes scanned the documents. "Thomas is a respected pediatrician." "He wouldn't, Mom." Emma's quiet voice cut through her mother's protests like a knife. With trembling hands, she held out her notebook. "Please read it." Dr. Morgan watched as Victoria accepted the notebook, her professional facade cracking with each page she turned. The color drained from her face as she absorbed her daughter's desperate entries. "I've also documented similar patterns with other young patients in Dr. Harrison's practice," Dr. Morgan continued, her tone gentle but firm. "He's been using his medical authority to essentially sedate young girls into compliance, disguising it as treatment for manufactured conditions." Victoria's hand flew to her mouth as she read one particularly coherent entry. "Dad says the medicines make me better, but I can't remember what better feels like anymore." "Oh God," Victoria whispered. "Emma, baby," she reached for her daughter, but Emma shrank back slightly, years of emotional distance creating an invisible chasm between them. "Mrs. Harrison," Dr. Morgan leaned forward, "I understand this is overwhelming, but we need to act quickly. Your husband returns from Chicago tomorrow, and Emma needs immediate medical intervention to safely withdraw from these medications." Victoria's lawyer instincts suddenly kicked in. "We'll need documentation, records, witness statements." "I have everything prepared," Dr. Morgan indicated the files. "But right now, Emma needs her mother to protect her." Victoria looked at her daughter, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time in years. Emma sat perfectly still, her father's chemical restraints still coursing through her veins, but her eyes were pleading. "The police," Victoria said, pulling out her phone with shaking hands. "We need to call them now. And I want a complete toxicology screen done immediately." Her voice broke. "My baby. What has he done to my baby?" As Victoria made the calls, Dr. Morgan moved to sit beside Emma, who had begun to tremble more violently. "You're very brave," she said softly. "Everything's going to change now, but I promise you won't have to face it alone." The next few hours passed in a blur of police statements, medical examinations, and tears. Victoria's legal expertise shifted into high gear once the initial shock wore off, coordinating with authorities and hospital administration. Dr. Morgan provided her with documented evidence of Thomas's systematic abuse of medical authority, not just with Emma, but with other young patients. By evening, an emergency court order was in place, preventing Thomas Harrison from contacting his daughter or accessing her medical records. Victoria had arranged for a security detail at their home and the hospital, her years of legal connections proving invaluable. As twilight settled over Boston, Emma finally slept in a supervised hospital room, the first steps of her medication withdrawal carefully monitored. Victoria sat by her bedside, her power suit wrinkled, her face streaked with dried tears. "I should have seen it," she whispered as Dr. Morgan checked Emma's vital signs. "I'm her mother. How did I not see it?" "He was careful," Dr. Morgan replied gently. "He used his authority as both a father and a doctor to hide what he was doing. The important thing is that you're seeing it now." Victoria gripped her sleeping daughter's hand. "I'll destroy him for this," she said, her voice hardening with the same determination that had made her one of Boston's top corporate lawyers. "He won't hurt another child ever." Dr. Morgan nodded, updating Emma's chart outside the hospital room where police officers stood guard. Somewhere in Chicago, Thomas Harrison was about to receive the call that would shatter his carefully constructed facade of control. In this quiet moment, watching mother and daughter begin their long journey back to each other, Dr. Morgan felt a profound sense of rightness. Sometimes, healing could only begin after everything fell apart. Emma stirred slightly in her sleep, her face peaceful for the first time since Dr. Morgan had met her. The bird was finally free of its cage, though learning to fly again would take time. But at least now she had a chance, and a mother who would never look away again. The media storm broke over Boston Children's Hospital like a winter nor'easter. Dr. Rachel Morgan watched from her office window as news vans gathered outside, their satellite dishes raised like thorny crowns against the gray November sky. Inside the hospital's administrative wing, an emergency board meeting had been in session for 3 hours. The arrest of Dr. Thomas Harrison at O'Hare International Airport had triggered a cascade of investigations, putting the hospital's oversight procedures under intense scrutiny. Dr. Marie Morgan appeared at her door. "They're ready for you in the conference room." Rachel gathered her documentation and made her way through the hushed corridors. Hospital staff stepped aside as she passed, their expressions a mix of respect and unease. Breaking ranks to expose a colleague had marked her as either a hero or a traitor, depending on one's perspective. The conference room held a collection of grave faces, the hospital board, legal representatives, and investigators from the state medical board. At the center of the long table sat Victoria Harrison, transformed from corporate lawyer to avenging mother. Ask, explain. Her presence commanding yet brittle, like glass on the verge of shattering. Rachel entered, her steps measured and deliberate, clutching the files that would either vindicate or condemn them all. "Dr. Morgan," Victoria said, her voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of raw emotion. "You've brought us this far. Let's finish it." Rachel nodded, setting the documents down with precision. The room fell silent as she began to speak, her words painting a harrowing picture of systematic abuse hidden behind white coats and prescription pads. Each file told a story: Emma's toxicology reports, other patients' medical records altered to justify unnecessary treatments, emails detailing Thomas Harrison's calculated manipulation of his peers and staff. It was damning evidence, meticulously compiled over months of sleepless nights and quiet determination. As Rachel spoke, Victoria's hands trembled slightly, gripping the edge of the table. Her corporate lawyer instincts had kicked into overdrive since yesterday, but now, sitting in this room, she felt something deeper driving her, a mother's ferocity. She glanced at the photo of Emma tucked inside the folder before her, taken just hours ago in the hospital bed where her daughter finally slept peacefully for the first time in years. That image fueled every decision she made today. The board members exchanged uneasy glances, their faces etched with shock and guilt. How had they missed it? How had she missed it? "We need full transparency," Victoria declared, breaking the tense silence after Rachel finished presenting. "An independent investigation into every case Dr. Harrison has touched. And we need to implement safeguards so this never happens again." One of the senior board members cleared his throat nervously. "Ms. Harrison, while your intentions are commendable, such measures could damage the hospital's reputation. My daughter almost died because of your negligence." Victoria snapped, slamming her palm on the table. Her outburst startled everyone, including herself, but she didn't care. Reputation doesn't matter when children are being harmed. If you won't act, I will personally ensure the public knows exactly what went on here. Her threat hung heavy in the air, sharp enough to cut through any resistance. No one doubted her resolve. Victoria Harrison wasn't known for making idle promises. Rachel stepped forward, placing a calming hand on Victoria's shoulder. "She's right," she said firmly, addressing the room. "This isn't just about saving face, it's about accountability. We owe it to Emma, to the other victims, and to ourselves to do better." Outside, reporters shouted questions at anyone who dared approach the hospital doors. Camera flashes lit up the gray afternoon like strobe lights, capturing snippets of chaos. Inside, however, the mood was somber yet resolute. Decisions were being made, not just about disciplinary actions against Thomas Harrison, but about systemic changes within the institution itself. Policies would be rewritten, oversight committees strengthened, and training programs revamped to prevent future abuses of power. By nightfall, the hospital released a carefully worded statement acknowledging the allegations against Dr. Harrison and pledging cooperation with authorities. For once, Victoria didn't craft the message herself, she trusted Rachel to handle it. Instead, she returned to Emma's bedside, watching her daughter breathe evenly under the watchful eyes of nurses monitoring her withdrawal symptoms. "You're going to be okay," Victoria murmured, brushing a strand of hair from Emma's forehead. "I promise." Emma stirred faintly, her lips curling into the ghost of a smile. In that moment, Victoria allowed herself to cry, not tears of despair, but of relief, anger, and hope. Hope that they could rebuild, that Emma would heal, and that justice would prevail. Meanwhile, in Chicago, Thomas Harrison sat handcuffed in a holding cell, his polished facade crumbling into dust. News of his arrest spread quickly, igniting outrage among colleagues who once admired him and sparking conversations about trust, authority, and responsibility in medicine. His carefully constructed world unraveled in mere hours, leaving behind only ruins. Back in Boston, Rachel stood outside the hospital, staring at the sea of reporters below. She thought about Emma, about Victoria, and about the countless others whose lives had been shattered by Thomas's greed and cruelty. Healing wouldn't come easily, it rarely did, but at least the truth was out. At least there was a chance for redemption. As snowflakes began to drift lazily from the sky, Rachel pulled her coat tighter around her. Winter was settling in early this year, but even amidst the cold, she felt a flicker of warmth. Sometimes, she realized, breaking everything apart was the only way to build something stronger. And so, as the media storm raged on and investigations unfolded, the journey toward justice continued, for Emma, for the other victims, and for a system that desperately needed reform. One step at a time, they were learning to fly again. Ask, explain.